Hello everyone, George DeSantis here with a look at the market for the week ending July 22nd, 2016. As we usually do, I'm going to take a look at the monthly chart first of the S&P, and we'll begin by doing so. And this is the monthly chart of the S&P 500 that we often look at. Um, since the S&P broke above that resistance level of about 2100 and change, um, it's been really moving very nicely up. So far, it's now closed at 2175, and you remember that we calculated a measured move from a triangle that I plotted on the one of the charts, as we'll see later, a measured move of 2200. So we're swiftly moving toward that level of 2200. What we should note here is that the market closed just at about the high for the month. Okay, the parabolic is below the most recent bar, so of course no signal to reverse this uptrend to a downtrend. The MACD histogram continues to trend up from below the zero line, and it's now just 4.55 points below the zero line. So this market is looking very strong to me, um, and when you look at the elder force at the bottom of the chart, you can see it broke above this trend line here, continues to go higher. Big question is how high? Well, we have a target of 2200, and from there we'll have to calculate and see where things go. In the meantime, of course, we can see retracements. I mean, the market doesn't continue to go up straight, as we all know. Let's take a look at a weekly chart. Here's a weekly chart of the S&P 500. Clearly, when we broke above the instantaneous trend line here, when the Kalman filter broke above the instantaneous trend line, that was the beginning of this really powerful uptrend with some corrections, a couple of corrections. But now we sit at, as I said before, 2175 and heading toward, in my opinion, 2200, which is that measured move from the symmetrical triangle that we saw on other charts. Um, again, we had gap up here, and now we're sitting up here. The instantaneous trend line is below the Kalman filter, and the Kalman filter is really seemingly accelerating this up move. Sooner or later, we're going to get correction, but at this time, if you're not holding stocks, you know, too bad. Now, RSI 12, we see RSI 12 here, since it crossed above the 40% line, continues to hold above it, and in fact, just simply found some support at the 50% line, and now we're above the 60% line. So that is confirming the strength of this uptrend. MACD histogram is now continuing to trend up from above the zero line. So there is that continuation of the uptrend signaled by the MACD. And at the bottom of the chart, percent R is now somewhere around 100, way above the 80% line, indicating that momentum for this uptrend is pretty strong, and we can see it right here. Kalman filter is just trending way up. Let's take a look then at the daily chart. Here's one of the daily charts of the S&P we usually look at. Now, on the daily chart, we have this 930 approach. In other words, this is 9 EMA. This is a 30 weighted moving average. This is exponential moving average of 9. And this is a 30 weighted moving average. We can see that since the 9 crossed above the 30 here, we've had this continuation of the uptrend. Now, we closed on Friday with a nice bullish candle. But what we find here is we've been consolidating for a while now. After this very nice long uptrend, we went into a consolidation move. Parabolic is below the most recent bar, which is Friday's bar. No indication that this trend is over. We calculated the measured move here from A to B. It was 90 points. The distance between the high and the low. High here, low here. And we added it to C, which is 2109. We got 2199, call it 2200. So we have a target of about 2200 on this, and we're already at 2175, as I mentioned before, well on our way to that 2200 target. Now, RSI 12 crossed above the 40% line here. We continue to trend up. We're now above the 60% line, and we continue to remain in very good territory here, bullish territory. Larry Williams pro-buying indicator. Here's the formula, it's very simple. The exponential moving average of the close minus the open for the last 14 days. That's what the formula is. It's very simple. And we can see that since it crossed above the zero line here, it remains above. And percent R, Larry Williams percent R with a 30 period, is also above the 80% line. So all in all, we are going through a consolidation period here. The probability is that we're going to break to the upside. Of course, we can always have a correction. That's always something we can expect. But in general, I think we're going up to the 2200 mark. So let's look at something else. Here's the other daily chart of the S&P 500 we often look at. The first thing that I notice here is that the Bollinger Bands of 2 standard deviations beginning to narrow here. So we're going into somewhat of a squeeze, as it's called. And we can expect this market to break either up or down. We don't know. But you usually get a break either up or down after the squeeze. You could see it happen here. We had a downtrend here. After here, we had an uptrend. So we can anticipate another significant move after the squeeze completes itself. So that's what I wanted to point out on this chart. Obviously, we still have the Fibonacci extension of 1.272. We crossed that level, that first Fibonacci target that we often look at, and we are still consolidating here. Now, in the middle of the chart, we have Jerry Appel's sum of the rate of change indicator, and although I usually use it on the NASDAQ, and his research really was set up to be used on the NASDAQ, I figured can do no harm to see how it performs on the S&P. And since it crossed above the 4% line, which is what this line is, it continues to remain above it, confirming this uptrend here. The other indicators we've seen before, MACD and percent R, no need to discuss those here. So we look at another chart. Here's that weekly chart of the S&P 500 that I showed you some time ago, a couple of weeks ago, and last week too. What we have is this megaphone or widening top here. We've since broken above it, but we should keep in mind that this is often a pattern that leads to reversal. We haven't had that reversal. We have the parabolic as we saw below the most recent bar. And at the bottom of the chart, we have the Commodity Channel Index, or CCI. For years, I've been using this on the weekly chart to buy and sell SSO, which is the S&P Leverage ETF. So buy here and sell when it crosses below. Sometimes I get whipsawed like here, but most of the time it keeps me in a trade in an uptrend, and I've been pretty happy with that. As I mentioned before, I didn't sell SSO even during some of these moves here. So now let's take a look at something else. Here's a weekly chart of the NASDAQ composite, and what we can see here is that the Kalman filter crossed above the instantaneous trend line somewhere in February, I believe, closer to the end of March, and since then it found support twice at the instantaneous trend line, which is the blue line. So it's trending up, and it has a very steep angle of ascent. So that looks well for the bulls. We should anticipate even higher highs here. Parabolic switched to below the most recent bar, and so now we have that uptrend, confirming that. RSI 12, as we saw in the S&P, crossed above 40% here and remains above it. In fact, it's above 60. As well as what we saw in the S&P was MACD is continuing to trend up. above the zero line. We see it here as well. So the weekly chart on the NASDAQ also looks very bullish. Let's take a look at the daily chart. Here's a daily chart of the NASDAQ, and a couple of new things here, apart from the ones we've seen before. First of all, note that on the daily chart, we also seem to be developing a squeeze. The Bollinger Bands are coming together closer, and the parabolic is below the most recent bar. Kalman filter is way above the instantaneous trend line. All of this confirms the uptrend, and so NASDAQ is also looking very strong. At the bottom of the chart is Jerry Appel's sum of the rate of change indicator. It's a sum of 3 or 4, I don't remember now, but at least 3 different time frames on rate of change, 5, 10, 15 periods, you know. And the way he uses it, and I use it, is to buy the NASDAQ when we get across above 4%, this line here. And it tested it, and it continues to go higher. I usually use the Qs, either TQQQ or triple Q or one of the other ETFs on the NASDAQ. So this is where we entered. I entered the trade, and this is where it is now. So that's a nice position to be in. NASDAQ is looking very strong as well. So before we leave the super charts, the charts from super charts, we can summarize, I think, by saying, look, the monthly chart is in a good, very strong uptrend. The weekly chart is in an uptrend, and the daily chart is in an uptrend. So apart from the fact that we have that megaphone widening top, and also that we've had this sort of parabolic move up, we might expect some correction, but it hasn't occurred significantly, hasn't seen any significant correction yet, but that we should keep in mind. Let's take a look at some of the other charts that we usually look at. Now, before we end, let's take a look at the stockcharts.com charts with the impulse bars, red, green, and blue bars. And what we can see here is a weekly chart of the S&P 500 with green bars. Okay, so that's very bullish. When we have green, we're allowed to buy. So we can buy the index, or if you wanted to look at an individual stock, just type the new symbol in there. Now take a look at the daily. The daily chart gives us those blue bars, which allows us to go either way, long or short. But since the weekly chart is on green, I'm not going to short this market by any means. So I would hold here. We either hold, but we're not allowed to go short if we have the weekly chart on green. And that's the way I look at it. And I think Alex Elder would agree with that. So right now the daily chart is on blue. We're consolidating. The weekly chart is on green. We are likely to go higher. Perhaps we might get a little correction, as I mentioned before. So in summary, the market is looking still pretty bullish. I have not sold anything. In fact, I've bought a few other stocks, and I'm holding on to the general indexes like the SSO and the Qs. And we'll do this again next week. Have a wonderful week.